Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Sayyidina wa Mawlana wa Habibina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa atba'ihi ajma'een. Welcome to this class. Welcome to, first of all, members of the Cambridge New Muslim Group, and welcome to those who are joining us online. We are broadcasting inshallah from the mosque of the Cambridge Muslim College, and the topic of this evening's class will be inshallah the life and the fiqh of al-Imam al-A'zam Abu Hanifa al-Nu'man radiyallahu an wa ardah. I'm going to start by just tracing the story of his life and starting that with some necessary comments about the difficulty of recreating a correct image of who he was and how he thought. Unlike the other Imams, he didn't leave us with a substantial book. Imam Ahmad left us with the great Musnad, which gives us a pretty clear indication, particularly if we read between the lines of what he includes and what he doesn't include, of what his fiqh was and what his position was. Imam Malik, of course, leaves us with the Muwatta. Imam Shafi'i with many great works, including Al-Risala, Kitab al-Umm, and others which we mentioned in the previous lecture, inshallah. But Imam Abu Hanifa is known primarily through the works of his disciples, particularly Imam Abu Yusuf and al-Shaybani, and also through the interpretations of some of their later disciples. Some of those later disciples were given in an age when there was a good deal of rivalry between the Madhhabs to forms of exaggeration and one-upmanship, and sometimes one needs to be careful when we as historians reconstruct a correct image of his life. Of course, the really great scholars, irrespective of their madhhab alignment, didn't get into that kind of one-upmanship. And in fact, it's actually pleasing to see that some of the greatest books written in praise of Imam Abu Hanifa are not actually written by Hanafi authors at all. Imam al-Suyuti, for instance, in his important book Thabit al-Sahifa fi Manaqib al-Imam Abi Hanifa, gives us a wonderful account of the sanctity of the Imam, even though as-Suyuti, Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, of course, was a great Shafi'i exponent. Similarly, Ibn Hajar al-Haytami wrote Khayrat al-Hisan fi Manaqib al-Imam al-A'zam Abi Hanifa al-Nu'man, which is, again, a great Manaqib work, that is to say, a book that contains edifying stories about the greatness of the Imam. Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, of course, another Shafi'i, and so on. Still, he doesn't leave a substantial book of his own, which does leave us as historians with a certain kind of problem. So we need Abu Yusuf and Shaybani's views. We need those of other contemporaries, some of his students, Uthman al-Batti, Ibn Shubruma, Ibn Abi Layla, and others. And there are problems even with these when we try to reconstruct what kind of legal thinker Imam Abu Hanifa was. We think we can do it through the works of his disciples, but even Shaybani's great works will typically cite the fatwas and the legal opinions of Imam Abu Hanifa without giving the detailed argumentation, the reasons why the Imam came up with these particular fatwas. They look more like works of furu' than works of usul. So we do need to be careful in presenting his thinking. Similarly, there isn't a single early text amongst his disciples where you get a consistent presentation of his usul, that is to say, his theory of the law. Some of the early Hanafi texts, like al-Pazdui, for instance, or Abu Hassan al-Karhi, don't give a sufficient amount of information as to exactly how they're transmitting their information from the Imam. The riwayah or the isnad may be absent. So in explaining his usul, and all of these great Imams were basically presenting methodologies, methods for interpreting the Quran and the Hadith in a maximally faithful way. We need to remember that we can't always be sure that his position was correctly inferred from the furu' of later generations. This is particularly a problem in the Hanafi context. And that's particularly acute, I think, when it comes to something that loomed large in his lifetime, given that he lived in an incredibly turbulent and difficult time. When it comes to his political theory, because there's nothing that he wrote or that has been authentically preserved from him which indicates explicitly what his particular take was on the political events of the time. We will see, and this is one of the rather beautiful aspects of his career, that as a Sunni he followed the middle path. He was a man of the Ahl al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that he loved the Ahl al-Bayt, but his doctrinal creed, al-Fiqh al-Akbar, and also a letter that he wrote to one of his disciples, Risala ila Uthman al-Batti, are completely unproblematically, emphatically Sunni texts. And also, his two great pupils, Abu Yusuf and al-Shayban, are very closely and intimately connected to the Baghdad caliphs of the Abbasid dynasty. Both were happy to accept posts as Chief Justice of Baghdad. And this position, this relationship continued in often complex ways, but became enormously important in the subsequent evolution of our history, so that the Qada of the Mughal Empire, one of the great political orders that the world has ever seen, was Hanafi. And also the Qada of the Ottoman Empire was consistently Hanafi as well. A connection between the Khilafah in particular, going back to the Abbasids and the way in which the Ottomans took it on from the Abbasids following their conquest of Egypt in the early 16th century, 1517, from the Mamluks, adopted the mantle of the Caliphate. So there's a connection between the Hanafi madhab and the Khilafah, which means that the official madhab of countries that used to be ruled by the Ottoman Empire in most cases to this day is Hanafi. So whether it be in Bosnia or Albania, or whether it be the official madhab of the muftis of Egypt or Syria or Iraq, these are Hanafi, irrespective of what the majority of the population might be, because of the historic connection of the madhab of Abu Hanifa with the Sunni Khilafah. So emphatically a Sunni position, but as we'll see, very open to connections with other points of view as well. So let's go through the details of his life insofar as we can reliably discern it. He was born in the city of Kufa, that's well known, in the 80 or maybe 81, but that kind of time. And his family is very interesting. Remember last time we looked at the family of Imam Shafi'i, and we saw his Hashimi lineage, how important that was to him and to his mother, and the implications that it had. Abu Hanifa is very different. Because his father is not quite a nobody, because he's wealthy, as far as we can tell, a wealthy trader, but he is originally from a family of Afghanistan. Kabul in Afghanistan seems to have been the place where Abu Hanifa's grandfather may have been taken as a war captive during the original Arab conquest, although there's different accounts in the early sources. But in any case, Abu Hanifa's father, Thabit ibn Zuti al-Farisi, are not Arabs. They are from the Mawali, that is to say, those non-Arab Muslims who attach themselves in a kind of client relationship to the conquering Arab tribes in order to give them a place in the emergent, in the Umayyad times, very hierarchical Islamic political order. So really different. Imam Shafi'i from the Hashemites, Abu Hanifa is from the back of beyond, Afghanistan, a wild land back then as it is to this day. But what it proves, and this is one of the most interesting aspects of the madhab, and one reason I think why it spread so extensively in non-Arab lands, is that it indicates another of the subtle and beautiful dimensions of early Islam. That the genealogical principle through our love for the Ahl al-Bayt and for the Bani Hashim is important, and Imam Shafi'i knew that. But at the same time, one of the things that Islam was doing in its formative moment was overthrowing tribalism and tribal pride, which had been the self-definition of Arab identity until the rise of Islam. So there's something about his emergence from nowhere that recalls that beautiful dimension of the seerah, whereby some of the greatest of the early Muslims came from genetically nowhere, like Bilal or Salman al-Farisi, or some people who were of slave origin, who were taken into the household and under the wing of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there's something about his madhhab and about him himself and the position that he took in the difficult period in which he lived, almost an impossible political situation he found himself in, that recalls that anti-tribal creation of a kind of super tribe. All of the Muslims are equal in the religion of Islam. And the Holy Prophet ﷺ indicated this. One of his greatest revolutions was that whereas before him Arabia had just been tribes, if you didn't have a tribe you were outcast, unimaginable, like a Hindu without a caste. And then Islam came, and in terms of what was important in your life, your status as a Muslim, what you could achieve, it didn't really matter. And ilm and taqwa were what were important. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The noblest of you in Allah's sight are those who have most taqwa. One of the most revolutionary things that the Quran was saying to an intensely hierarchical and ethnically obsessed Arabian world. So he's from this dimension of the prophetic revolution, the, as it were, egalitarian dimension, whereby anybody can be brought into, as it were, metaphorically, the Prophet's family. He says, Salmanun minna ahl al-bayt. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Salman, who is also Persian origin, is from us, the people of the house. And he said, Ali kullu barrin taqi. My family incorporate everybody who is good and is pious. Consider how he brought Bilal so close and chose Bilal to be the one who would proclaim the adhan symbolically from the roof of the Kaaba after the conquest of the city. And Abu Lahab, a close relative, was excluded and pushed out. Religion, piety, spiritual greatness were the new definers of what it meant to be a Muslim. So this is significant, and his fiqh becomes, in a sense, related to the concerns and the identity of the Mawali in the time of the Tabi'een. First generation of Muslims are the Sahaba, the companions, and the Tabi'een are their disciples, the people who saw the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Tabi'een. And one of the most extraordinary things in the whole history of Islamic thought and culture is the fact that fiqh, and in fact scholarship generally, in the time of the Tabi'een was amongst the non-Arabs and not amongst the Arabs. Abu Hanifa comes explicitly from that world. Most of his teachers were in fact of non-Arab origin. So just to give you an example of the tensions, because these were kind of ethnic tensions that were quite intense. There were a lot of Arabs of a traditional stamp who thought that they were, as it were, the lords and masters, and everybody else was kind of a second-class citizen. But the reality is that so fundamental was this overthrow of the traditional class system and caste system and tribal system that the great leaders of the religion in the second generation are actually of non-Arab origin. So Ibn Abd Rabbih, in his Al-Iqt al-Farid, which is a nice historical work, tells us stories like this. قال لي ابن أبي ليلى. Ibn Abi Layla said to me, قال لي عيسى بن موسى. عيسى بن موسى said to me, وكان ديانا شديد العصبية, and he was one of these Arab nationalists. Right? من كان فقيه العراق. This Arab nationalist is saying, who's the greatest scholar? Who's the faqih of Iraq? Who was it in your time, the time of the Tabi'een? قلت الحسن ibn Abi al-Hasan. I said it was al-Hasan ibn Abi al-Hasan. قال ثم من? قلت محمد بن سيرين. And he said, and then whom? Muhammad bin Sirin. قال فما هما? And he said, and what are they? قلت مولايان. And I said, two non-Arabs. قال فمن كان فقيه مكة? And he said, and who was the great scholar of Mecca? And I said, عطاء بن أبي رباح, and Mujtahid, and Sa'id bin Jubair, and Salman bin Yasar. قال فما هؤلاء? And he said, and what are they? قلت موال, non-Arabs. قال فمن فقهاء المدينة? And he said, and who are the great jurists of Medina? قلت زيد بن أسلم ومحمد ibn al-Munkadir ونافع ibn Abi Nujih. And I said, and mentioned these three individuals. قال فمن هؤلاء? And he said, and who are they? قلت موالي. I said, they're not Arabs either. فتغير لونه. And his color changed. He was getting angry. ثم قال فمن أفقه أهل قباء? And then he said, and who was the most learned of the people of Quba? قلت ربيعة الرأي. Remember him, the teacher of Imam Malik. وابن أبي زناد. قال فما كان? And he said, and what were they? قلت من الموالي. They were also non-Arabs. فاربد وجهه. And his face really started to change. ثم قال فمن فقيه اليمن? And he said, and who was the great scholar of the Yemen? قلت طاووس وابنه وابن منبه. And I said, Tawus and his son and Ibn Munabbih. قال فمن هؤلاء? And he said, and who were they? قلت من الموالي. They weren't Arabs either. فانتفخت أوجاجه. And his cheek started to swell up. وانتصب قائما. And he stood up out of his anger. قال فمن كان فقيه خراسان? And he said, and who is the great scholar of Khurasan, Central Asia? قلت عطاء ibn Abdullah al-Khurasani. And I said, عطاء ibn Abdullah. قال فما كان عطاء هذا? And he said, and what was this عطاء? قلت مولى. He was not an Arab. فازداد وجهه تربدا. And his face became even darker. واسود اسودادا. And became black. حتى خفت. Until I started to become afraid for him. I thought he'd have a stroke or something. ثم قال فمن كان فقيه الشام? And then he said, and who was the great scholar, the great jurist of Syria? قلت مكحول. I said مكحول. قال فما كان مكحول هذا? And he said, what was that مكحول? قلت مولى. He was a non-Arab. فتنفس السعداء. And then he started hyperventilating. ثم قال فمن كان فقيه الكوفة? And then he said, and who is the great scholar of Kufa? فوالله لولا خوفه لقلت الحكم بن عتبة وحمان بن أبي سليمان. And because I was now afraid that he might have a stroke or something, I would actually have said Al-Hakam bin Utbah and Hamad bin Abi Sulaiman, as we'll see as Abu Hanifa's great teacher. وَلَكِنْ رَأَيْتُ فِيهِ الشَّرْ. But I was afraid for him. فَقُلْتُ إِبْرَهِيمَ النَّخَعِي وَالشَّعْبِي. And so I said Ibrahim bin al-Nakha'i and al-Sha'bi. قَالَ فَمَا كَانَ. And he said, and what were they? قُلْتُ عَرَبِيَّان. Two Arabs. فَقَالَ اللَّهُ أَكْبَرُ وَسَكَنَ جَأْشُهُ. And he calmed down. So that's an indication of really something quite extraordinary when you consider how quickly all of this has happened and how it's the Arabs who are engaged in the conquest, that Abu Hanifa is coming from a generation where scholarship, the leadership of the religion, is overwhelmingly in the hands of new converts, usually people from the eastern region, Central Asia, and from Persia, but also from local non-Arab populations in Iraq, Egypt, and elsewhere. This is actually predicted by the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's a hadith which is in Bukhari and Muslim where he says, لو كان العلم معلقا بالثرايا لناله رجال من أهل فارس. Were knowledge to be attached to the Pleiades, a bunch of stars, light years away, people from Persia would be able to reach it. And some of the scholars have said this is actually a prediction of Abu Hanifa radiallahu anh, whose ancestry is from Afghanistan, which is in the Persian cultural world. This is clearly interesting, and we need to ask ourselves why it should have been the case. Why were the Arabs not conspicuous in the leadership of early Islam? One explanation is that they were the ones who were busy with the jihad and with the conquest, and they had to leave religious leadership to others. But Ibn Khaldun has actually quite a long and interesting discussion on this in his Muqaddimah, his great work of history. He asks, why is it that the leadership in early Islam, the time of the Salaf in particular, was by and large not Arab? And this is what he says. ثم صارت هذه العلوم كلها ملكات محتاجة إلى التعلم فاندرجت في جملة الصنائع وقد كنا قدمنا أن الصنائع من منتحى الحضر وأن العرب أبعد الناس عنها. Then he says, and all of these sciences, he's talking about the disciplines of fiqh and tafsir and grammar. He says, all of these became subtle knowledges which required learning and therefore became, as it were, like crafts, like professions. And he says, we've already explained that professions and crafts are to do with city life, but that the Arabs were the furthest of people from such life. فَصَارَتِ الْعُلُومُ لِذَلِكَ حَضَارِيَّةً. So the intellectual disciplines are disciplines of the cities. وَبَعُدَ عَنْهَا الْعَرَبِ. And the Arabs were remote from them. وَالْحَضَرْ لِذَلِكَ الْعَهْدِ الْعَجَمِ. And the settled people in that time were the non-Arabs. أَوْ مَنْ فِي مَعْنَاهُمْ. Or other non-Arabs, not necessarily of Persian origin. مِنَ الْمَوَالِي وَأَهْلِ الْحَوَادِرِ. The people, the Mawlas, the new converts who are attaching themselves to the Arab clans, and the people of the cities. So that's Ibn Khaldun's explanation. Why is it that the leadership of Islam in the time of the Salaf, particularly the time of the Tabi'een and the Atba' al-Tabi'een, overwhelmingly is non-Arab? It's because these are people who have brought into Islam the knowledge of what scholarship means. They know about writing, they know about libraries, they know about books, they know about law. Of course, they're the ones with their deeper cultural urban traditions who are going to immediately, from the Arabs, take over the leadership of the religion. And this is Ibn Khaldun's explanation, and it does make a lot of sense. He's born in Kufa, in the time of the Tabi'een, although it's almost certain that he meets some of the Sahaba, so he's considered to be a Tabi'i himself. Whether he actually narrates from the Sahaba is disputed, but he certainly meets some of the very old companions of the Holy Prophet. Brought up in Kufa, which is the biggest, most significant city in Iraq at the time, spends most of his life there. We're not entirely sure what his father did, but it seems fairly sure that he was a merchant, reasonably well off. Again, if you accept the story, which most of the historians present, of his grandfather being a kind of bondsman taken in captivity after the capture of Kabul, it's indicative of how slaves and others could make good in this new, enormous, very commercially active imperial civilization. But in any case, it's clear that he must have been a good Muslim, because we know that Abu Hanifa learns the Quran at an early time. And there were family stories about what they did when they first came to Kufa. One of the stories was that Abu Hanifa's grandfather, on the Persian feast of Nowruz, would send Persian sweets to Ali ibn Abi Talib, who of course was headquartered at the city of Kufa. When he was young, كان يختلف إلى السوق قبل أن يختلف إلى العلماء. When he was young, he used to go to the market before he went to the scholars. And in fact, he starts off as a merchant with a fairly successful shop in the bazaar in Kufa, and he remains in business all of his life. And this is one of the interesting dimensions of Abu Hanifa's career. But he also, in an early age, learns the Quran, and part of his devotion, his particular ibadah, is a very, very strong attachment to Allah's book. So it's said, at least by some of his fervent admirers, that he used to read the whole Quran through 60 times during the month of Ramadan. And the tradition is that there were 4 Imams who were known to recite the entire Quran in 1 rak'ah. So this would be presumably in a tahajjud prayer. To do it properly, you really needs about 7 hours. And those are Uthman bin Affan, Tamim ad-Dari, Sa'id bin Jubair, and Abu Hanifa. 4 people who in Islamic history have the reputation of reading the whole Quran in a single rak'ah. And the Quran is really at the center of his specific type of taqwa. But back to Kufa. Kufa is an interesting place. It's not like Imam Malik being brought up in Medina where everything is Islamic and the Prophet's fragrance is everywhere. Kufa is different. It's a new city, garrison town, been established by the conquerors, and it's a melting pot for everybody and everything. If you think of the map of the ancient world, Iraq really is at the center of everything. This is the land of Sinbad the sailor. They're trading throughout the world. They're going to China, Central Asia, North Africa. Iraq is the very center of civilization, and the beginning of civilization is Mesopotamia, after all, which had the first cities that we know of. So everything is coming in there. There's Greek philosophy knocking around. There's Persian medicine. Christianity of many, many, many different kinds in Iraq, particularly Nestorian Christianity, which now hardly exists, but then was very important. Nestor was the patriarch of Constantinople, who developed the idea of Christ having two separate natures, the human nature and the divine nature, like two minds contemplating each other in the single person. And the other churches of the East are called Monophysites, the Copts, the Jacobites, and so forth, who say that no, there's just one mind with a human and a divine nature, but they're fused. But Iraq is the center for this Nestorian idea. And many, many Islamic sects as well. The Kharijites really are headquartered in southern Iraq. The Mu'tazilites kick off and really always have their center of operations in southern Iraq. And the Shia, although in this period they're not really a sect with their own distinctive doctrines, it's more like a political point of view, a political party, also have the greatest number of supporters in southern Iraq in this period. So this is really a very turbulent place. And of course, Abu Hanifa, as a teenager, is hearing all of this stuff. And one of the attractive aspects of his personality is that he really wants to understand everybody's point of view and learns from them. He, as you can imagine, this is a city of argument. These are all people who are absolutely convinced of their religious rightness, and everybody's arguing. And if you've got a shop, it seems he was dealing in silk and linen garments, mainly women's clothes. Of course, everybody's going to be talking, and where do they talk? They talk in the bazaar, they talk in the shop. So he's hearing from an early age all of this chit-chat about every conceivable idea in existence. And he absorbs them, and he gets involved in the arguments because he's a Sunni, he's from a new Muslim family, so particularly passionate. He loves the Quran. He takes part in these debates in the shop and elsewhere, but he doesn't have enough knowledge really to be decisive. He's spending too much time in the market. And then there comes his great, as it were, conversion moment. It's said that once when he was walking through the Souq in Kufa, he encounters one of the great hadith scholars and jurists of the city of Kufa, who is al-Imam al-Shafi'i radiyallahu an. And al-Shafi'i has been watching him and notes that he's always engaged in these, I suppose the 7th century, 8th century version of modern internet polemic. Everybody's arguing, but not everybody has much knowledge. So al-Shafi'i tells him, عليك بالنظر إلى العلم ومجالسة العلماء فإني أرى فيك يقظة وحركة. He says you should look into scholarship and you should sit with the scholars because I can see in you there is a wakefulness and motivation. So he takes this advice and increasingly leaves his shop in the hands of a partner or assistant who does most of the work there. And from then on tends to spend only part of his day there or visits it just to make sure that the business is going well. But he doesn't close it. And this is quite characteristic of Islam. Many of the scholars have had their own private income. One reason, of course, is to be independent. You don't need to take a purse of gold from a governor or a sultan if you have your own income. But also it seems partly because being right at the center of the market gave him an opportunity to think about law, about society, about ethics. And also, it seems, to serve others. He had the kind of mercantile piety that used a shop as an opportunity to serve society, to give a good price to the poor in particular, and to demonstrate honesty. And in fact, in our tradition we have some very beautiful works on what nowadays would be called business ethics, and very often the stories are about Imam Abu Hanifa and his shop. So for instance, he would never take an unfairly low price. There's an incident that had everybody in the bazaar chattering because a woman came in, a poor woman, to sell a robe, maybe it was a wedding dress or something, and she wanted 100 dirhams for it. And Imam Abu Hanifa looked at it and said, 500 would be a good price. He wasn't engaging in sadaqah, it was actually the correct price for this garment. And she said, are you laughing at me? But he insisted that this was the correct price. That doesn't often happen in the real world of commerce, that somebody comes to you with a price and you say, no, actually, I think I should be paying more. When you sell a house or sell anything, generally it tends to be the other way around. But this was his particular form of taqwa, a mercantile piety that is actually very important in our civilization. So there's other incidents that are narrated. On one occasion, he sends off his assistant in order to deliver a garment to somebody who's ordered it, and tells the assistant, tell the purchaser that it's got a defect, it's torn in this corner, and don't take the money until you've shown it. The assistant delivers the garment, takes the money and goes back and said, I'm afraid I forgot to tell the purchaser about the defect. Abu Hanifa sends him back, but they can't find the purchaser. He's a traveller. And so Abu Hanifa immediately, of course, gives the price of the garment to the poor in sadaqah. So this is how to understand his life. He's right at the centre of society, and therefore the law school that comes out of his mind is something that is profoundly real and connected to the actuality of people's lives. You could say the same of the madhhab of Imam Malik, of course. But Abu Hanifa is somewhat different in that his city is so cosmopolitan. There's so many different kinds of people. And he himself is actually part of the economic life, the economic establishment of his city. He seems to have made quite a good living. He was a prosperous person. There's nothing wrong with that in Islam. And was well known for cultivating a beautiful appearance. He always wore a valuable robe, used plenty of perfume. His sandals were always properly fastened and mended, unlike a lot of scholars at the time who wore patched robes and had sandals that were a kind of disaster area. Abu Hanifa was always smartly turned out. And in fact, he insisted that his students should also dress well. Once he saw a student who was really scruffy and told him, underneath this carpet there's some money, take it and smarten yourself up. And the student says, actually, I do have money. And Abu Hanifa still told him to improve the way that he looked. يَنْبَغِي لَكَ أَن تُغَيِّرَ حَالَكَ. He says to him, you should improve and change the way you look. حَتَّى لَا يَغْتَمَّ بِكَ صَدِيقُكَ. This is an interesting way of thinking. So that your friends don't feel bad about you. It's not that you're going to show off by looking cool in the souq. No, it's so that people don't feel sorry for you, that they're not concerned for you, that they don't think maybe they should be giving you money. If you've got money, you should be a smart person. Otherwise, others will be sad. Interesting way of looking at it. In any case, he's now taking Imam al-Sha'bi's advice to stay with the ulama. عَلَيْكَ بِمُجَالَسَةِ الْعُلَمَاءِ. But the issue is, which scholars? Everything is on the market, as it were, in the city of Kufa at the time, from extremist Shia to the Kharijites to a million kinds of other denominations, the Mu'tazilites, very active. So he's looking at the Sunni context. Like most converts in Islamic history, he tends to be strongly Sunni. And he sees that there's different sorts of Sunni circle, and he has to decide which one he's going to join. There's the circles of aqa'id, where people are developing arguments to defend the Sunni aqidah against the views of various people with strange new notions. There's the circles of hadith, where people are transmitting hadith, and these people are known for zuhud. And from these circles of hadith in Iraq, the movement known as tasawwuf emerges. Close symbiosis between the people of hadith and the people of tasawwuf, and in most cases they're actually the same people. If you look at the Hilyat al-Awliya of Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani, Tabaqat al-Sufiyya of al-Sulami and others, you'll see the early hadith scholars are the first Sufis. But the third kind of circle is the circle of people who are talking about literature, because the Iraqis really love the Arabic language, they develop Arabic grammar, poetry, adab. That's going on as well. It's a very cultivated place. But the circle that he chooses to join is the circle of the people of fiqh. And that's not the same as studying hadith. A lot of people nowadays think that hadith and fiqh is the same thing, but absolutely not from the perspective of the Salaf. And you won't understand the emergence of fiqh and the whole structure of Islamic law unless you understand the difference between the people of hadith and the people of fiqh. Why does he make this choice? Why not hadith? We can see that he knows hadith very well, but he's also a practical person. He's constantly dealing with issues, legal issues, commercial issues, ethical issues, decisions, relationship issues even, in the marketplace. And he likes fatwa, he likes judgments, he likes ways in which religion can practically sort out people's problems. And he knew that hadith is just one dimension of fatwa. You can't give fatwas just by knowing the Quran and the hadith. It's said that he made this decision to join the circle of the people of fiqh rather than hadith when he saw somebody who came to a hadith scholar with a question about a divorce case, actually unable to do anything, but just narrated a whole bunch of hadiths which needed interpretation but didn't give that person an answer. So he used to say, whoever learns hadith without fiqh is like a chemist who collects medicines without really knowing what to do with those medicines, and it's the doctor that has to come and use them. And the hadith student similarly doesn't know what to do with his hadith until the faqih, the person of fiqh, comes along and makes use of the hadith. He is concerned with the rectitude of Sunni belief, and his name is associated with one of the great traditions of Islamic theology, the Maturidi school, as it came to be known. And he is in that polemical world. He wants to uphold truth. He spends some time in Basra, which is a nearby city, it's the port of Iraq, where he's arguing with members of other sects. And there's a certain polemical dimension to what he writes. But in Kufa, he settles down to the study of fiqh. Sometimes the polemic continues, sometimes people from other sects come into his mosque in order to dispute with him, and he uses logic and reason and his knowledge of hadith to debate with them, particularly the Khawarij and the extreme Shia who are present in Kufa at the time. But generally his way is to dislike disputation in aqa'id and in kalam. He saw the need for them, but he didn't like too much religious argy-bargy and argumentation. Partly because, like all of the great scholars, he saw the danger of the ego becoming involved. If I define my identity, the meaning of my life in terms of what I believe, then myself and my pride are very closely connected to my ability to vindicate what I believe and therefore to disprove what other people believe when they disagree with me. So the ego very easily gets tangled up in aqidah discussions. So there's a story about how he once saw one of his sons, Hamad, disputing doctrine. فَنَهَاهُ, and he forbade him to do that. And everybody said, رَأَيْنَاكَ تُنَاظِرُ فِي, we've seen you engaging in doctrinal disputes. وَتَنْهَانَا عَنْ, but you're telling us that we can't. فَقَالْ كُنَّا نُنَاظِرُ وَكَأَنَّ عَلَى رُؤُوسِنَا الطَّيْرِ مَخَافَةَ أَنْ يَزِلَّ صَاحِبُنَا. Listen to this answer, it's amazing. He said, we used to dispute people on issues of theology, and we used to do so with such humility that it was though there were birds sitting on our heads, in other words, sort of still with our heads down, a position of humility. مَخَافَةَ أَنْ يَزِلَّ صَاحِبُنَا, for fear that the person we were disputing with would make a mistake. وَأَنْتُمْ تُنَاظِرُونَ وَتُرِيدُونَ زَلَّةَ صَاحِبُكُمْ, but you people, you dispute with people hoping that they'll make a mistake. وَمَنْ أَرَادَ أَنْ يَزَلَّ صَاحِبُهُ فَقَدْ أَرَادَ أَنْ يَكْفُرَ صَاحِبُهُ, and whoever wants the person he's disputing with to make a mistake in aqidah effectively wants that person to become a kafir. وَمَنْ أَرَادَ أَنْ يَكْفُرَ صَاحِبُهُ, and whoever wants the person he's sitting with to become a kafir, فَقَدْ كَفَرَ قَبْلَ أَنْ يَكْفُرَ صَاحِبُهُ, he is a kafir before the person he's debating with becomes a kafir. That's an amazing consequence of having no ego. It's very unusual in theology for people to engage in the defense of the truth without their own sense of self-worth becoming tied up with it. But this was Abu Hanifa's justification for getting into Sunni kalam and aqidah disputations. The condition has to be that you want to help the person that you're disputing with, rather than treating it as some kind of game of one-upmanship. Very difficult. Generally, as a result of that, the strong spirituality is that the Hanafi school in doctrine is characterized by a certain breadth and, you might say, tolerance. So, for instance, one of the characteristic points of the doctrine of his school is that Iman consists in what you believe in your heart and what you say you believe. That's the definition of Iman. And unlike Malik and Shafi'i and many of the others, he doesn't add, and you have to confirm it with what you do. In other words, Iman includes practice with your limbs. So the Maturidi school, which eventually comes out of Abu Hanifa's theology, actually doesn't even require professing with the tongue. They say you can be a mu'min and have Iman, even if it's just the belief in your heart. Even if you never say it and never act on the basis of it, you're still mu'min, you're a believer. So that's a very kind of open and affirming strategy, which is characteristic to this day of the Maturidi school. If you go to a Islamic theology faculty in Turkey or Bosnia where they're teaching the Maturidi Aqidah, this is the position that they will tell you. But he's focusing mainly on fiqh, and he likes to have just one teacher, and this is the Hamad bin Abi Sulaiman, who we mentioned earlier, and he stays with him year after year until Hamad gives him ijazah, gives him permission to give fatwa. So he's mainly in Kufa, the disciple of Hamad, but he makes the Hajj many times. Some of the hagiographic works will say he made Hajj more than 50 times. We don't really know that. Iraq was not so far from Mecca and Medina, and the scholars would study as they went. They would ride camels side by side and exchange views and carry their books with them. So it was just another way of studying. But in any case, he goes to the Hajj many times and spends some time in Mecca and Medina, and in the holy cities he's associating with other ulama. And he spends time with people of fiqh, and particularly those who had been the pupils of the muftis amongst the Sahaba. So he says, تلقيت فقه عمر وفقه علي وفقه عبد الله بن مسعود وفقه ابن عباس عن أصحابهم. I learned the fiqh of Umar and the fiqh of Ali and the fiqh of Abdullah bin Mas'ud and the fiqh of Ibn Abbas from their own pupils. And he continues like this until about the age of 40, when his teacher Hamad dies. And then he sits in Hamad's mosque in Kufa, and he has ijazah now to give fatwa, and he gives fiqh and he gives fatwas, and becomes really, really respected and famous throughout the Islamic world. Also, partly because of his attachment to Allah's book, partly because of the self-transcendence that is evident in these stories about how he did business and how he justified his engaging in doctrinal disputes. Some of the great works of Islamic sainthood, Tabaqat al-Awliya, include him amongst the awliya as well. So Imam al-Sha'rani, for instance, Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani, has a whole section on Abu Hanifa, just considering him as a saint, as a wali. Now, this is a turbulent place already because of the doctrinal landscape. It's a collage of every point of view. Difficult place to be religiously, but it's also difficult politically, because at the age of, when he's 52, the Umayyad Caliphate comes to an end and the whole world is in uproar. The Abbasids have unfurled famously the black banner of revolt in Central Asia, and they march, and after a series of battles they take the Islamic world, and the Islamic world, with the exception of Spain, which is still Umayyad, becomes Abbasid. And they are ruling as descendants of the Holy Prophet's uncle, Al-Abbas. Now, Abu Hanifa, of course, is at the center of the political world, which is a religious political world at the time. Everybody is justifying their rule on the basis of religious claims. And he doesn't like any of the options that are available. he never likes the Umayyads, and particularly the later Umayyad rulers to him seem completely dreadful. But he doesn't join any rebellion, unlike some of the scholars, and he sympathizes with some of them. He sees these passionate, beautiful young men who can't stand the corruption of the caliph and the torture and the wine and all of the abuse of the ideals of Islam, and they unfurl the banners of revolt and, usually in a hopeless, quixotic way, fight against the imperial legions, very often in the name of the family of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But he himself, although he can see the value of these people and their heroism, doesn't take arms himself up ever in one of these causes. He sympathizes with them not because he has a belief that only a certain set of imams should rule the world or have some sort of supernatural knowledge. Nothing in his Aqidah work suggests that he had such a belief, but because he really, really, really is disappointed with the Umayyads, and he can't help but sympathize with these protest movements. In his late 40s, as the Umayyads are crumbling and collapsing, and particularly right to the end of their rule, the remaining Umayyad governors in Iraq try to twist his arm to work with them, but he refuses. He's imprisoned, he's beaten. It seems that he escapes from prison, perhaps with the connivance of the Jallad, the flogger or the torturer, who admires him, and he leaves Iraq and goes to Mecca. And Mecca is important for him. He's already been, but here he's spending more time and he's learning the fiqh of Ibn Abbas's pupils. And here he spends maybe 5 or 6 years as a mujawir. A mujawir is somebody who is, for religious reasons, spending time in the holy cities, whether it be Mecca, Medina, or Jerusalem. The Abbasids finally take over. The revolution happens, and he's invited by the scholars of Kufa to be their representative when the new caliph comes to ask for their pledge of allegiance. This is going to be very ticklish. Kufa was the city of so many Shia rebellions, the city of the Khawarij. It was a place that the Abbasids really wanted to get on side. Many of the scholars of Kufa had collaborated with the Umayyads and therefore couldn't really show their faces in the presence of the new Khalifa. So they invite Abu Hanifa to be their representative because he's always refused to collaborate with the Umayyads. And the new Khalifa comes in state into the mosque, and Abu Hanifa, on behalf of the scholars of Kufa, takes bay'ah with the new Khalifa and prays for him. He agrees to visit the Caliph and keep company of him, particularly the new Caliph, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, but he refuses any gifts or form of payment. And again, there's an interesting story here, which I can't resist sharing with you. This is an interesting example of the difficult relationship he has with the new caliph. He wants the unity of the Muslims. He doesn't believe that there should be some infallible imam ruling the show. He certainly doesn't believe in the literalist hadith fanaticism of the Kharijites. He wants something that's inclusive, and he's willing to take the Abbasids at their word, the descendants of the Hashemite. But he always has a difficult relationship with them, and eventually, as we'll see, that becomes his downfall. Here's an interesting story which gives an example of his fiqh in action. I particularly like this one. لقد وقع بين المنصور وزوجه الحرة شقاق بسبب ميله عنها. Once it happened that al-Mansur, this is the caliph, was estranged from, or basically had a row with one of his free wives because he'd been preoccupied with his other wives. وَطَلَبَتِ الْعَدْلَ مِنْهُ, and she didn't like this, and she wanted justice to be done. She wanted him to deal with her justly, or there would be a divorce. فَقَالَ لَهَا بِمَنْ تَرَضِينَ فِي الْحُكُومَةِ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَكَ. And so the caliph said to her, who do you want to have as a, what would we call it nowadays, a mediator between us? Who's going to be the arbiter, the referee between us? Who do you want to do it? قالت Abu Hanifa, and she said, It has to be Abu Hanifa. فَرَضِيَ هُوَ بِهِ أَيْضًا. So the caliph agrees to this also. فَأَخْتَرَهُ. So he brings him to the palace. وَقَالَ لَهُ يَا أَبَا حَنِيفَةَ. And he says to him, O Abu Hanifa, الْحُرَّةُ خَاصِمُنِي. My free wife is arguing with me. فَانْصِفْنِي مِنْهَا. So deal with me justly. قال أبو حنيفة ليتكلم أمير المؤمنين. Abu Hanifa says, let the commander of the believers speak. قال يا أبا حنيفة كم يحل للرجل أن يتزوج من الناس. And he says, O Abu Hanifa, how many women can a man have lawfully? فيجمع بينهن. قال أربع. And he says he can have 4 wives. قال وهل يجوز لأحد أن يقول خلاف ذلك. And he said, is it permissible for anybody to say anything else? قال لا. And he said, no. فقال أبو جعفر. And then the caliph said, قد سمعتي. He says to his wife, you heard what he said. فقال أبو حنيفة إنما أحل الله هذا لأهل العدل. And Abu Hanifa says, Allah has only allowed this to the people who are able to be just. فمن لم يعدل أو خاف ألا يعدل فينبغي ألا يتجاوز الواحدة. And whoever is not just amongst them, or is afraid that he might not deal justly with them, it is right that he should not have more than one. قال الله تعالى فإن خفتم ألا تعدلوا فواحدة. Allah says, and if you are afraid that you might not deal equally with them, then only one. فينبغي لنا أن نتأدب بأدب الله. And it's right for us to take the words of Allah to heart. ونتعظ بمواعظه. And to accept his reproaches. فسكت أبو جعفر. And Abu Ja'far, the caliph, fell silent. وطال سكوته. And was silent for a long time. فقام أبو حنيفة وخرج. And at length Abu Hanifa got up and went out. فلما بلغ منزله. And when he got home, أرسلت إليه خادما. The queen sent to him a servant. ومعه مال وثياب وجارية وحمار مصري. And gifts, wealth, new clothes, a servant girl, and an Egyptian donkey. فردها معه. And he sent them back with him. قال للخادم أقرئها سلامي. Give her my greetings. وقل لها, and say to her, إنما ناضلت عن ديني وقمت ذلك المقام لله. He said, I wasn't defending you, I was defending my religion. وقمت ذلك المقام لله. And I stood like that for the sake of Allah. لم أرد بتلك تقربا إلى أحد. I didn't want to become closer to anybody as a result of what I did. وَالْتَمَسْتُ بِهِ دُنْيَا. And I didn't want any worldly thing. And that's an example of this relationship. He was prepared really to anger the caliph and support the case of one of his wives simply because of his desire that Allah's law should be upheld. But then a crisis occurs. He's not a Shi'i, that's not in any of his fatwas, and he's made bay'ah to the Khalifa, but then there's a rebellion. These pro-Shi'i rebellions that have happened here and there in the Umayyad period start to happen again because people don't like the Abbasids either. So Muhammad al-Nafs al-Zakiyya, who was from the Ahl al-Bayt, and his brother Ibrahim rebel. This is difficult for Abu Hanifa because he'd been friends with his father and with their father and studied with him, and their father was now in prison. The 2 leaders of the revolt were killed. And this really is the end of his friendly relations with the Abbasids. And al-Mansur is not sure about him and starts to spy on him. He sends the Abbasid equivalent of MI5 to watch him, to have him tailed. But it's difficult for him to take steps because Abu Hanifa is really the best known Sunni scholar around, and he's pious, he's saintly, scholarly. He doesn't have any political record of joining any of these revolts. But eventually the caliph finds a strategy. He invites him to become chief judge. And he refuses, as the caliph kind of expected that he would. And then he asks him to become chief mufti, that is to say, the one who is like the leading legal consultant for all of the judges, and he refuses that as well. And al-Mansur then, in his capacity as caliph, swears that Abu Hanifa will do this. And Abu Hanifa, in his capacity as the great jurist, swears that he will never do it. And there's a standoff. And the caliph's chamberlain, al-Rabi', says to him, to try and defuse the situation, أَلَا تَرَى أَمِيرَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَحْلِفُ. Don't you see the commander of the faithful has taken a vow, has taken a pledge? فقال أبو حنيفة, and Abu Hanifa just says, أمير المؤمنين أقدر على كفارة أيمانه مني. And he says, well, the commander of the faithful, Abu Hanifa says, the commander of the faithful is more able to pay the compensation, the fine, for breaking a pledge than I am. فأبى أن يلي فأمر به إلى الحبس. So when he really refuses to take up this position, he doesn't want to be an agent of that government, he's taken away. The police take him and he goes to prison. Why does he refuse? Not because he's withdrawn his bay'ah. He doesn't consider the ruler to be outside his allegiance. It's just because he doesn't want to become a political tool or to legitimize the uglier actions of the caliph. What happens in prison? Well, there's different historical records. Here again, it's hard to piece the details together. Some accounts say that he was flogged and then poisoned and died in prison. Other accounts say that the caliph didn't want to create a scandal and released him from prison, but forbade him to teach, and then he soon died effectively under house arrest. He dies in the year 150 of the Hijrah. And before dying, he does two things. First of all, when he's already sick, it seems, he dictates something called his wasiyah, which means almost like a last will and testament, which is a short kalam work. It's a short book of theology in which he indicates correct from false belief, because for him this is hugely important. And the wasiyah Abi Hanifa becomes an influential guide to the founding positions of the Hanafi Aqidah and Kalam. And the second thing he does on his deathbed is that he requests that he be buried only in land that has not been unlawfully expropriated by the state. يوصي بأن يدفن في أرض طيبة لم يجري عليها غصب. He asked that he be buried in good land which had not been confiscated. وَأَلَّا يُدْفَنَ فِي أَرْضٍ قَدِ اتُّهِمَ الْأَمِيرُ بِأَنَّهُ غَصَبَهَا. And that he shouldn't be buried in any part of land, any place in the earth where the Amir, the Caliph, had been even accused of taking the land over. And it said that when the Caliph al-Mansur heard of this, he said, Abu Hanifa is a nuisance to me, alive and dead. It was just embarrassing that this was the last thing that he said, that he was implying that the caliph had been illicitly just confiscating people's property. So he dies, maybe poisoned. The word gets out, even though the funeral, janazah, has to happen quickly. 50,000 people assemble. It's a big thing in Iraq from different perspectives. Al-Mansur sees his popularity and also comes and prays by his graveside. So that's the end of his life, a difficult life, prosperous and a great scholar, Al-Imam Al-A'zam. Still, the district where he's buried in Baghdad is called Al-A'zamiyah, the district of the greatest Imam. And his madhhab is more widespread than any other fiqh position in Islam, as we've seen. India, Central Asia, the old Ottoman world, that's a measure of the success and the practicality of his fiqh. Let's delve into that before we finish, into a little bit more detail. He was once asked by the Caliph al-Mansur, where did you get your knowledge? He's trying to get him to make a political statement again. It's a kind of leading question. قال عن أصحاب عمر عن عمر وعن أصحاب علي عن علي وعن أصحاب عبد الله عن عبد الله وما كان في وقت ابن عباس على وجه الأرض أعلم منه. So he said, I got my knowledge from the companions of Omar, who got it from Omar, from the companions of Ali, who got it from Ali, from the companions of Abdullah bin Mas'ud, who got it from him. And in the time of Ibn Abbas, there was nobody on the face of the earth more knowledgeable than him. So compare this to what we've learnt about Imam Malik's rootedness in the Sunni practice of the faithful people of Medina, and in Imam Shafi'i's travels and his acceptance of Malik's fiqh, and then his understanding of the Hanafi position on Ra'i and reason, and his ending up finally in Egypt. Abu Hanifa is also, although he's earlier than Imam Shafi'i, he's the teacher of Imam Shafi'i, taking from these different sources. Taking from Omar, that means Medina. He's taking from Ali, basically that means Kufa and southern Iraq. He's taking from Abdullah bin Mas'ud, also from Iraq, also Ibn Abbas and the tradition of Mecca. So all of the great early tendencies of fiqh, Abu Hanifa has studied. And because it's from such an early period, he studied with the pupils of the Sahaba who founded those schools of fiqh. But Ibn Mas'ud and Ibn Abbas in particular were well known as advocates of intuitive or rationalizing approaches to law. And this is very important, particularly in the development of fiqh and sharia as it happens in southern Iraq. His own teacher Hamad had emphasized the need to trust reason. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, one of the great tabi'in of southern Iraq, in a sense, in his fatwas and his fiqh, the closest of all of the early scholars to Abu Hanifa, somebody like Shah Waliullah Dahlavi and other late Hanafis are saying, really it's the same thing. Abu Hanifa's fatwas are the fatwas of Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. Spends time in Mecca as well and takes from Ata, who is the great disciple of Ibn Abbas, and so on. But what's more interesting, as well as these sources, he's taking from the partisans, the political party of Ali. So he studies with Zayd ibn Ali Zayn al-Abidin, one of the great Imams of the Ahl al-Bayt, and studies with him for 2 years, and also with his brother Muhammad al-Baqir. And important to understand this, because to us it might seem strange. Why is he going to the Shia to study? In that period, those words didn't mean what they meant later on. Those Imams were respected by all of the Sunnis and were part of the family of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The later ideas of infallible Imams and knowledge of hidden things were not present. The idea that miracles could only come through the Ahl al-Bayt, that true rulership could only come through the Ahl al-Bayt of a particular line, that did not exist for these people. If it had, Abu Hanifa, staunch for truth, would not have associated with those people. But he did, and he studied with them. Those people were part of the scholarly establishment of the time. And Imam al-Baqir was known for although he supported the claims of the Ahl al-Bayt, لا يذكر الخلفاء الثلاثة بسوء. Never would he mention any of the 3 first caliphs in a negative way. Once an Iraqi fanatic came and criticized them in his presence, and he became angry, and he cited all of the verses of the Quran, one after the other, that are in praise of the first 3 Khalifas. So Imam al-Baqir teaches him. He also teaches al-Baqir, who narrates certain fatwas from Abu Hanifa. Al-Baqir's son, Ja'far al-Sadiq, who is almost exactly Abu Hanifa's age. In fact, they're born within months of each other. They're born in the same year. And they seem to have had kind of close friendship and affiliation. They also have this close scholarly relationship, and all of the Sunni Imams revere Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, who transmits hadith, is a reliable hadith transmitter. And this, as it were, cosmopolitan approach of Abu Hanifa is interested in knowledge, fiqh, fatwa, what's usable, hadith. And he visits people of different political persuasions. He doesn't accept a salaried position from any government, or Umayyad or Abbasid, so he's free to wander and to visit any majlis he chooses. Al-Mansur once famously sends Abu Hanifa to Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, who he really doesn't like, even though Imam Ja'far is not involved in any kind of revolutionary insurrection or insurgency. He's living in peace. The Caliph wants to catch him out and to prove that he's inadequate as a scholar. So he asked Abu Hanifa, find the 40 hardest questions in the whole Sharia and go to Ja'far as-Sadiq and ask them. And he answers them all, one after the other, explaining which jurists he's taken them from. Some he's learnt from the scholars of Medina, others are Syrian positions, others are from the people of Iraq. And Imam Abu Hanifa, after that, says an interesting thing. He says the most learned scholar is the one who is best informed of the differences of opinion amongst the scholars. That's why he venerates Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, because of his respect for the different fatwas of the different scholars. Ja'far as-Sadiq is narrating from people like Nafi' and Zuhri and some of the great tabi'een. Sometimes Abu Hanifa gets his knowledge of the position of the tabi'een through Ja'far as-Sadiq. Imam Malik also narrates from Ja'far as-Sadiq. He's just part of the intellectual world of the time. His pupils we've already mentioned briefly, who are the ones who really spread his madhab and write it down and make it systematic. There's three names that we should be aware of in particular. One of them is Abu Yusuf, who is Yaqub bin Ibrahim al-Kufi, who is, as we saw last time, an influential teacher on al-Shafi'i. And through Abu Yusuf, the intellectualism, the systematic jurisprudence of the people of Iraq triggers something in al-Shafi'i's mind, and eventually you get the great Risala as a result. Another of his great pupils is Zufar al-Basri. Abu Hanifa used to say, I have 36 students who I think are serious. 28 I think are good enough to be judges, 6 are good enough to give fatwas, and 2 are fit to keep the judges and the muftis in line. And he points to Abu Yusuf and Zufar. Again, remember, this is characteristic of the Salaf. Very few people are capable of giving fatwas. Not like nowadays where everybody has a view on religion. I've heard this and I've heard that, but I think that X is the correct view. I found this in a hadith or whatever. Total chaos. The way of the Salaf is for most, even of the scholars, to remain silent when asked for fatwa and not to do it. Only a few people have the courage and the knowledge to give religious rulings. Otherwise, you just have chaos, and he was well aware of that. That is the way of the Salaf. The third of his great pupils is Imam al-Shaybani, that's Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani, who's a significant author. He writes Kitab al-Athar and also a very interesting book called Kitab al-Siyar al-Kabir. Because of the political ructions of the time, he writes something which is about the fiqh of government and things like international relations, the conduct of war, diplomacy. It's been translated into English by Muhammad Hamidullah, if you want to look at it, and it's a very interesting law of nations, and to this day in some Muslim countries where they teach diplomacy and public service, they will look at that text. It's still really very interesting. Finally, very briefly, we've already indicated as we went along his story the characteristics of his madhab, seeing how syncretistic it is, taking from Mecca, taking from Medina, taking from the cities of southern Iraq. But we could say, as a kind of generalization, that it is, of the four madhabs, the one that is most emphatic in its trust of human intelligence and of aql, the mind, intellection. This is a root which is important in the Quran. There's about 50 times in which it appears, as well as other words, ulul albab, ulul nuha, people of intelligence, people of understanding. And it's interesting to note that nowhere in the Bible, for instance, is there praise of human intelligence and of reason. But in the Quran, there are constant references to the need to use reason and to understand. Before Islam, moral knowledge had really been tribal. There wasn't really a tradition of working ethics and ideas out using reason. The Quran comes to sweep that away and says it's لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, to a people who think, and it appeals to universals. There are universal rules, right and wrong, which are intrinsic. This becomes an important part of Hanafi and then Maturidi moral theology. There's an intrinsicality to values. Now, for Abu Hanifa, and remember he's working in a world where there are so many different opinions and so many people who are fabricating opinions and hadiths and Quranic interpretations, putting them into circulation in order to support various sectarian views. He says, because the Quran appeals to reason and says to the people of Makkah that they should be using their reason in order to determine whether their gods actually make sense, or whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can actually resurrect people from the dead. It's a text that invites us to use our reason, that we need to use this in the law as well. The believer should trust his intuition. He should trust his aql, which means something that could include logic, but means something deeper, that we have an intrinsic natural knowledge of what is right and what is wrong, and that should be an important factor in determining law and determining fatwa. And again, you can see how he links this, or it's rooted really in his own experience as somebody who'd been actively involved in the economic and moral life of a complex new town of Kufa, that very often the jurist, as well as the qadi, has to use his sense of what's right, his intuition. And Islam as a religion which values aql emphasizes that very much. Unfortunately, some Muslims nowadays think that religion is a kind of alternative to using your brain, that we don't have a tradition of thinking systematically, that we don't need logic, that we don't need to study grammar, that we don't need to be systematic about our approach to religion. We just grab an ayah from here and a hadith from there and attack everybody who disagrees with us. But this is not the way of the early Muslims. Abu Hanifa, in his emphasis on aql and ra'i, is taking from the position of the earliest Muslims and of the Sahaba, and particularly the school of Ibn Mas'ud and Ibn Abbas, where human reason and intuition, while they can never replace revelation and they can never challenge revelation, are very important guides to truth and help us to determine the correct interpretation. Literalism was never the way of the Salaf, with the exception of the Kharijites, and we know where that led them. The way of the Salaf was intelligence and wisdom, because they were people of fitrah. Fitrah is just another way of saying intelligence, moral intelligence, natural common sense. And there's a dispute nowadays, just to take the story up to date, as to whether indeed wisdom and moral knowledge are innate, or whether they're just something that we learn from society. There's an interesting book by somebody called Peter Carruthers, Human Knowledge and Human Nature, where he says, although he's working from a perspective of neo-Darwinian evolutionary biology, that a knowledge of right and wrong is something that is intuitive. He calls it a folk psychology, a network of common sense generalizations. We know what's right. We know what's wrong. Children have an intuitive knowledge. And certainly that would correspond in its own way to the Hanafi understanding, which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us as noble beings, beings that can recognize the existence and the nature of God, can recognize the moral law, even if we don't have access to a revelation. Otherwise, how could we know that revelation was true? If we didn't have some external way of assessing that the revelation is moral and that it makes sense, revelation would not be incumbent upon us to follow. We have something that's prior to revelation, which is the ability to reason, which is why the Quran is sent to ulul albab, the people of intellection. This is very important for Imam Abu Hanifa, very important for the subsequent tradition of Islamic theology and law, and we become par excellence the civilization of reason. Unfortunately, nowadays there are some who think reason is not part of Islam, it's some extraneous thing, it's fallible. But alhamdulillah, the way of the Salaf is quite other than that. And if you look at the fatwas of the great tabi'een, and particularly people like al-Sha'bi and Ata, Sufyan al-Thawri, you can see that very much they're people of intelligence, of moral intelligence, where compassion and a sense of justice shape their understanding of what the correct and faithful understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah ought to be. So alhamdulillah, we've come to the end of this sadly all too brief session about Imam al-A'zam Abu Hanifa radiyallahu an wa arda, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inshallah to make us people who combine aql and naql, intelligence and revelation in the best way, because it's only when the ummah gets that balance right that its affairs publicly and in the world of law and sharia and doctrine will also be right. Too much rationality can lead us astray. Too much scripturality without the application of reason can also lead to the catastrophes of the Khawarij. The scripture is fully accessed by the human mind. We do not have full use of our mental faculties. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshaAllah, to bestow that upon this ummah. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.